according to the NAACP, as of 2014, African Americans accounted for 34% of the total 6.8 million people incarcerated. 153 years ago, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery in the United States. However, racial oppression and segregation would continue to find different ways to manifest itself in society. Presently, in 2018, one of these different ways is commonly known as mass incarceration, or it is also referred to as the prison boom, mass imprisonment, the carceral state, and even the new Jim Crow. Despite all the different terms, they all have the same meaning. It refers to the high prison population rate concentrated among African American men, verified by the American Civil Liberties Union and various other sources. And because of this, we are compelled to ask today's question of what exactly is mass incarceration and how do we continue to see the detriments of it in today's society? After the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that led to the abolition of the Jim Crow South, new mechanisms such as the overrepresentation of African Americans in the media as criminals began. Secondly, federal laws reinforcing racial bias. And third, the expansion and weaponization of police departments led to a new way to oppress people of color. This new way of oppression is known as mass incarceration. Next, we'll be focusing on the large problem areas of mass incarceration. First, the media is a large informant of crime and news in the United States, and most Americans access credible news directly through media outlets, opposed to social media due to the recent wave of fake news. However, the problem with this is that it's plaguing America is the overrepresentation of African Americans as criminals within news media outlets. This overrepresentation occurs when African Americans are portrayed as violent or with malicious intent. It becomes misleading and creates a stereotype correlating crime with blacks. These analyses illustrate that violent crime specifically is more likely to be associated with African Americans than it is with whites, according to Oliver as of 2015. This misleading information aroused for racial tensions to continue to heighten. The policies resulted in targeting African Americans in poor urban areas, and these convictions were complemented with harsher and longer sentencings to prolong the time spent in prison. It was skillfully designed to make sure that the destabilization among African Americans would occur. So even if they were to exit prison, the African American community faces these difficulties to where it is very hard to retain normalcy after somebody has been convicted and it is on their record that they had already been to prison. For example, formerly incarcerated people can be automatically banned from driving or getting professional licenses, for example, as accountants, nail technicians, hairstylers, or barbers, according to McGall-Nagise as of 2015. This goes to directly show that many people argue that it is very easy for these people to retain normalcy and go back to their everyday life after exiting prison, but because it is on their permanent records that they have been to prison and that they've been convicted of these certain crimes, it is very hard for them to go ahead and even walk a path to a normal life because it's hard for them to get certified or trained for any type of job when it continues to sustain their record. And it becomes the quite opposite. Rather than things coming easy, it continues to become harder for these people who are victims of incarceration. There are far less opportunities for work, regardless of any background or experience held, because once an individual experiences mass incarceration, it stains their record forever, something far more intensely experienced by people of color. The lack of opportunities to pursue a career is a long-term effect of mass incarceration. Individuals argue that the intent of the war on drugs policies that was carried out under Ronald Reagan's administration was to target violent drug offenders. However, that was not the end result of it at all. If examined carefully, the result was very disproportionate and very direct, that it was meant for African Americans. A solution to bring down the incarceration rate would be to implement a federal law that decriminalizes certain drugs. For example, if marijuana was decriminalized, it would reduce the number of individuals incarcerated. In addition, while there will still be fines to pay for it, it will eliminate the threat of going to prison and slowly strengthen the minority community. Because if we look and examine these incarceration rates, it's seen that many of these people are locked up in jails because they are unable to pay their bail fines. So, due to these small misdemeanors or small petty crimes, they're locked up for many years and then they are unable to go ahead and gain opportunities once they exit the prison system. For example, according to the Prison Policy Initiative as of 2019, we can see that approximately 1 million people are locked up in state prisons and that 612,000 people are in local jails and 221,000 people are in federal jails. This pie chart that is as of 2019 goes to show where um, all of the incarcerated people are held throughout the United States. Next, mass incarceration is a proliferating problem in America um, because of federal policies that allowed for it to occur in the first place. Former President Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan launched a policy known as the War on Drugs. 1 million over the 1 million of the over 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States are African Americans, and African Americans are incarcerated 6 times the rate of whites, according to Stephan 2018. These policies are skillfully crafted. They target poor urban areas rather than a specific group of people. However, a large percentage of people living in poverty stricken areas are people of color. Mass incarceration just doesn't stop at the federal level, but it continues to pour into local government surroundings as well. There's a stark difference between poor urban communities comprised of people of color and richer areas that belongs to whites. The difference between the two communities arises from the people of color that face police brutality. In cities across America, such as in New York, Chicago, Ferguson, Los Angeles, this intensive policing has become routine in the communities. Racial tensions are proliferating due to racial biases and predispositions that are portrayed and enabled through the media. A possible solution to end this large problem of mass incarceration that's plagued itself across the United States will need to be reinforced through past policies that continue to present detrimental effects on America today. But law enforcement and local levels need to receive reinforcement as well and reform as well. In order for society to prevent the oppression of African Americans, the first step would be to not allow racial bias to be embodied into the government through discrete ways. So the routine policing that occurs in these poor urban neighborhoods would be one of the first ways to go ahead and decrease the number of African Americans incarcerated. Secondly, this is an issue that just does not have to have one singular solution, but rather it needs to be addressed in a multitude of ways. For example, the US justice system needs reform. Meanwhile, the first step to acknowledge the problem, um, meanwhile, the first step is to go ahead and acknowledge the problem and acknowledge that racial disparity continues to exist in the United States. The second being educate yourself on the systematic racial oppression that is inflicted by the United States onto people of color. The systematic racial oppression continues to occur in present day America despite the fact that there is written legal law permitting it. It continues to manifest itself every passing year due to the chain link of events. It begins with first racial biases and predispositions that are portrayed and enabled through the media. Secondly, it is not only reinforced through past policies that continue to have detrimental effects on America, like the war on drugs, but law enforcement at the local level continues to do it today through the routine policing of these poor urban neighborhoods. In order for society to prevent the oppression of African Americans, the first step would be to not allow racial bias embodied into the government, and then after that, we can continue to go ahead and educate and inform the public, and from there on, reform will continue to happen.